Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Principles of the U.S. Export Control, presented by the Federal Laboratory Consortium for Technology Transfer. My name is Amy Thompson, the FLC's Director of Professional Development, and I will be your staff host today. All lines have been muted to ensure high quality audio, and today's session is being recorded. If you have a question for the panelists, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature. If you have a technical question or a comment, please feel free to use the chat. Next slide, please. Join us for the FLC 2022 virtual national meeting. It is virtual June 21st through the 23rd. The QR code is available for you if you would like to register that way, or visit federallabs.org. I now have the pleasure of introducing you to today's distinguished speaker, Michael Hoffman. Michael Hoffman is the Director of the Bureau of Industry and Security's Western Regional Office. BIS West provides guidance to industry on U.S. national security, foreign policy, and non-proliferation-based trade regulations and policies. In previous management positions, Michael set up and managed the agency's Eastern Regional Office to provide counseling services throughout New England and New York. In Washington, D.C., he served as the director of the agency's special licensing branch, where he was responsible for managing a licensing program that authorized over $40 billion in exports annually. Michael received a master's degree in government from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California, Berkeley. Please join me in welcoming Michael Hoffman. All right, take it away, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present this morning. So, as Amy said, I'm with the Bureau of Industry and Security, and we administer the export administration regulations. And it's maybe a slightly different topic for many of you, but I hope that in this time we have together, I can explain to you why you might be impacted on regulations affecting exports, and where specifically you might have risks. From that point on, I'll give you kind of a general overview of the export control system and probably help walk you through any requirements you have for authorization. So next slide. Okay, export controls seem to have a kind of cachet these days. I think it reflects the view that if we do the export controls right, if we do them on a multilateral basis, enlisting partners in like-minded countries, we can come up with a coherent set of controls that offers an effective means of furthering U.S. and allied national security and foreign policy interests. For a long time, these were kind of business page issues, if that. But now with Russia, you can see many of the export control issues being on the front page of major newspapers, sometimes even above the fold. Next page. So the export control system is something that is both multilateral and interagency. It's designed to further U.S. national security and foreign policy interests. We pursue these goals with like-minded countries in Europe, the Far East, that have put in place a comparable set of controls on a specific range of technologies for a specific set of purposes. The organizations we work with are called the Wassenaar Arrangement, which works together on national security issues, national security controlled technologies, Nuclear Suppliers Group on nuclear issues, Australia Group for chemicals and biological, and the Missile Technology Control Regime, which is probably no great surprise what they might work on. It's also an interagency process that works with the Department of State, Department of Defense, and Department of Energy. Here you can see a couple of our key organizational partners. The Bureau of Industry and Security works primarily on exports of commercial or less sensitive military items. The Directorate of Defense Trade Controls within the Department of State works on issues related to defense articles and services. And the other major organization in the export control arena is the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Department of Treasury, which does trade sanctions, controls of the money flows. Next slide. So as I mentioned, our agency is primarily a national security agency. It's interested in furthering national security, foreign policy, and non-proliferation goals. We derive our authority from something called the Export Control Reform Act from 2018. From that, we derive our export administration regulations. Now, these regulations are quite voluminous. I'm going to try to simplify them to make them applicable to you today, but for any specific needs you have, please do refer to the actual regulations rather than anything that I may have summarized in this short presentation. Next slide. So, exports. For our typical audience, the manufacturers in the United States, distributors, people taking hardware and sending it abroad, the concept of an export is fairly well understood. An actual physical export or transmission of information outside the United States. An export can also encompass, under our regulations, a release of technology or source code to a foreign person in the United States. This is called a deemed export, and it's a concept that tends to pull within our regulations entities like academic institutions and national labs. Next slide. So I mentioned the phrase deemed exports, and this is a deemed export is considered a release of technology or source code subject to our regulations to a foreign national in the United States. That is considered to be or deemed to be a transfer to that national's home country. Now, this doesn't count US citizens or dual citizens. It doesn't count those with green cards. It doesn't count those who have some sort of a protected status, but it does catch a number of foreign parties that happen to be in the United States to whom you may be interested in transferring technology or information. So a deemed export it can be a release of technology or source code. And in these slides, you'll see quotation marks around some of these phrases or words. These are specifically defined terms in our regulations that have a meaning that's perhaps not a common usage. So I'd caution you that as I explain these, if I use these terms of art, that there is a specific meaning behind each and every one of these phrases. So on this middle bullet, I'm talking about the release of technology or source code. It means if you allow for a visual inspection of equipment, or you have an exchange of information, or perhaps release a network key, this could be construed as a deemed export. Next slide. So where can this happen? This can happen in a tour of a facility where a piece of equipment or a product line is shown. It can be a release to foreign students studying within the United States. It can be just a general transfer of information. But it is specific with regard to a phrase, technology. It's the release of technology. Technology is one of those defined terms, and in our regulations, we define it as the information that's necessary for the development, production, use, operation, installation, maintenance, repair, overhaul, or refurbishing of an item. It's not just general conversation that we are trying to regulate through the export administration regulations, but the specific know-how that facilitates operation, installation, development, production. So not all company tours or facility tours are considered a release of technology. Not all presentations in an academic environment are considered a release of information, but it can be very much more defined. Next slide. So that's how academic institutions and laboratory personnel can be brought into the export administration regulations system and caught within the scope of our regulations. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about not just how these regulations may be, how they may impact you, but more specifically, what type of information may need to be considered of greater concern. Excuse me. So, subject to the EAR, subject to the Export Administration regulations. These regulations cast a very broad net over the export or deemed export of a broad range of technologies worldwide. It may be easier in this instance to define what is not subject to the EAR, to look at those kinds of transfers of technology in labs, in the lab's instance or in academia's interests, to get a better clue as to where these regulations might implicate your activities. Next slide. So there are, actually, let me take a step. Items. Items means literally anything. It could be technology, it could be a physical item, something your parents might have referred to as thingamabobs. It's whatever. Items is a very broad term meant to encompass virtually everything. So things that are not subject to the Export Administration regulations would be those items that are subject to the regulatory jurisdiction of another agency, say the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls on munitions items, the Department of Energy or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on items having to do with nuclear applications. Those items are outside the scope of the Export Administration regulations, so they're not subject to them. You also have certain printed material or information that is publicly available. Printed books, pamphlets, items in a library, maps, phonograph records, all of this is outside of the scope of the Export Administration regulations. Next slide. I'm going to dwell on this one a little bit because it covers some of the key elements of where a deemed export that I spoke of earlier and items or technology subject to the EAR can interact. So again, here I'm talking about items that are not subject to the EAR. So if the deemed export, if the transfer of information covers these kinds of items or these kinds of transactions, then it's outside the scope of the regulations and doesn't require authorization. So for transfers of published technology or software, information that is out there, it's on the website, it's in a freely accessible library, subscriptions that are available without any vetting of who's going to receive them, open libraries, distribution of information at, say, an open conference, not one that is limited in who may attend, again, for public dissemination. Items or publications that are intended to be published. So they're not publicly available yet, but they're going off to peer review prior to being published. All of those items, all of those types of transactions are outside the scope of the Export Administration regulation. Also patents and information in open patent applications. So that covers some of the published technology and software application. And now I'd like to move on to discussing the fundamental research that we're talking about. That's another aspect that is outside of the scope of the Export Administration regulations. Next slide. So fundamental research, this is basic information that is meant to be out released to the public. This slide talks a little bit about the inputs to fundamental research and the outputs. For technology or software going into the fundamental research, that can be subject to the Export Administration regulations or not subject to the Export Administration regulations. It depends on what it is. Then the outputs, once the decision is made about the technology, will that release of information be restricted in some form or another, or is it intended to be openly distributed? Next slide. So here we have a discussion of fundamental research. And again, this is kind of the second prong. The first was published information. This is fundamental research. If you have in the center the universe of technology, you have the inputs that are leading into it and you have the outputs from it. So if you have publicly available information going into the technology sphere, that's not subject to the regulations because it's publicly available. It was the first leg of the stool, the first tier. However, if it's controlled information in some form, the process of putting that technology into the fundamental research milieu can require authorization. It depends on what the item is and who may receive it. So that's the input side. On the output side, regardless of the inputs, if the results are intended to be published, that output can well be considered fundamental research and outside the scope of the Export Administration Regulations, not requiring any further authorization. If, however, that information may be withheld for some reason from the general public, then ongoing restrictions on the technology may apply depending on, again, what it is and where it's going. Next slide. So here are just three examples. You've got research conducted by a lab for product development and subject to a non-disclosure agreement. Would this be subject to the Export Administration Regulations? And the answer is, well, maybe. It depends on what the technology is and where it's going. It is not self-evidently outside the scope of our regulations. The second example could be a research project funded by NASA for use by NASA and its partner agencies. Is this subject to the Export Administration Regulations as fundamental research or as publicly available information? Again, maybe or maybe not. It's hard to tell. Probably, but not necessarily. Again, it's going to depend on the specifics of the technology, the activity, and the recipient. And the last one, I'd say a grant awarded by NIH for research intended to be published in a scientific journal. If it's an open scientific journal, this is very likely to be outside the scope of our regulations and not requiring any kind of specific authorization within our regulations. So I've covered a fairly broad range of concepts here. And before I go on to describe what the system is and how it goes forward or how it works, I'd like to make sure that I haven't completely lost you. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them at this time. Again, we've talked about deemed exports, which is a concept of how your activities could end up being caught by these regulations, and subject to the EAR, which covers the type of transactions where the deemed export comes into play that might be subject to our regulations requiring some sort of authorization. Amy, have I completely lost everyone? Have I stunned the people into silence? Are there any questions?
No questions as of yet. So I just wanted to touch base with you, let you know as people are generating some questions. If they do, I'll send them your way.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So you have a deemed export, conceivably, and you have a transfer of technology that may end up being subject to the AR. What does that mean? I'm going to give you kind of a quick rundown on our system and the export control system and what it means. Subject to the Export Administration Regulations means that there are applicable regulations to this transfer. It doesn't mean that specific authorization from the Department of Commerce is required. There are many authorizations that are available without any specific advanced approval, and some things can be transferred with under the authorization that's entitled no license required.
Mr. Hoffman, we do have one question right now.
Okay, great.
A patent is a limited form of protection that will eventually be published. Does this restriction count?
If it's information that's in an open patent application, it's an intent and it's intended to be, as part of a patent process, yes, that kind of transfer of information can take it outside the scope of our regulations. PTO has a set of controls that they have over certain types of information, but that is something that we won't particularly be looking at. It's not subject to our authority.
Okay, and then follow up, a green card does not count, but student visa does?
An individual who is in the United States under a green card, for example, they would be not counted as a foreign person for the purposes of being considered, the transfer being considered a deemed export. Someone who's here under some sort of a protected status, under a green card or a US citizen, transfers to those individuals are not subject to the export administration regulations for deemed export purposes. Someone who's over here is on student visa, yes, conceivably they could still be caught by these provisions.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Is the research sponsor the final arbiter of the decision regarding what is subject to control? Will the process be described later?
I'll talk about authority that's required for export, who's required to get it. The sponsor of the technology, or the person providing the information, doesn't have control per se on the authorization that's needed, only that if there is a requirement that it be withheld and not broadly made available, that statement, that requirement, can put it within the scope of our regulations. They don't authorize the export. That's a separate process that I'm going to get to in a moment.
Okay, thank you. One more is putting a 30 to 60-day wait on release of publication of research considered not fundamental?
A simple delay for publication purposes does not necessarily take it out of fundamental research or publicly available. If information is intended to go to be made publicly available, that's going to take it out of the scope of our regulations.
Okay, great. I think those are it. We're ready to move on again. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. So if I were talking to a manufacturer, a distributor, someone who takes objects and sends it out of the country, this is probably where I would start my presentation, to give you an overview of the export administration regulations and the export control system. But that's not typically the interest of, say, those who are transferring information domestically. So I'm going to cover this material very briefly, hoping that I can make it comprehensible. We have information available on our website that explains this, again, differently, better, simpler, in a more fun manner. But I'm going to cover it here briefly for you, just to get a sense of, to provide you a sense of what it is that the system does. The key elements under the export administration regulations on an export are: what is it, where is it going, who's going to get it, and what are they going to do with it. Next slide. So this slide actually has to do with what is it. Not everything is of national security or foreign policy concern, obviously. The Commerce Control List describes a range of technologies in exquisite detail for hundreds of pages to describe those items where the US government has a proliferation-based concern or a national security concern or a foreign policy concern with the product. And again, each of the entries, each export control classification number or ECCN defines specific products. It can define semiconductor manufacturing equipment. It can describe specific types of encryption technologies, aircraft components. If an item is listed on the Commerce Control List, that means it probably has a reason for control for national security, foreign policy, regional stability, crime control, surreptitious interception of communications reasons. There's a whole variety of reasons that we would control them. That leaves out a whole universe of items that are not subject to the Export Administration Regulation. A watch, for example, not something that we would consider controlled for national security, foreign policy reasons. Those items fall into a basket category called EAR 99. These are items that are subject to our regulations, but don't have a specific level of control attached to them. Meaning that for the most part, you're probably not going to face any kind of authorization required for the transfer or export of the item. Next slide. So once you've identified if you have an item that is subject to the regulations and it's in an export control classification number, it's going to tell you why the item is controlled. Here on an excerpt from this chart, you can see chemical and biological weapons, nuclear, non-proliferation, national security columns, and the ECCN, the export control classification number, will tell you which column to be looking at. And then you look down the list of countries and find out whether or not there's an X in the box at the intersection between the reason for control and the destination. If there is an X in the box, that means there is a presumption of a license required for that item to that destination. That's just the kind of the first layer of it. And next slide. Now, it's not only where it's going, what it is or where it's going. It could be who's going to get it. There are a number of individuals that have violated our regulations and have been placed on something called the denied persons list. Those individuals are precluded from participating in our regulations in an export transaction, no matter what it is. So if this watch is going to a denied person in France, it would require an authorization from the Department of Commerce, and it would be denied. We also have other restricted parties within the commerce list, certain military end users in destinations, like Russia, for example, right now. State Department has restrictions of their own, their debarred list. The Department of the Treasury has their specially designated nationals list, global kingpins, terrorist organizations. These parties are prohibited from receiving literally any kind of good or have very specific limitations on what they can get. Next slide. Exporters would typically look at a consolidated screening list, which is available from our website. They can put in a name and find out very quickly whether or not the party is on one of these restricted lists. Next slide. Even if the product's not of great concern and the destination isn't of particularly great concern and the end user is not prohibited in any way, there are certain types of activities that the federal government wants to take a closer look at. If an end user is involved in nuclear weapons development, for example, specific missile technology issues, we may require an authorization, a license, or some other authorization to get the goods to that specific individual to make sure that it's not a problem recipient. Next slide. So if there's an X in the box, the item is controlled for a specific reason to the destination you want to ship it, it requires an authorization. There's a process for applying for a license. You can apply online license applications take about 28 days on average. We all know what an average can mean. Some of them fly through very quickly. There are others at the tail end that take considerably longer. I'm not going to go into any detail because you may not end up ever looking at a license process, so I don't want to spend time on it. Next slide. So the X in the box, a license or license authorization of some sort is required. There are other processes for shipping goods out of the country without obtaining a specific written license that I just described. These are license exceptions. These take transactions where there's a lesser degree of concern, where the item might require an authorization to a specific destination, but for one reason or another, it's not of great concern. For example, let's take an item that would require a license going to, say, Egypt. The item requires a license going to Egypt, but it's going to a US government organization in Egypt. Well, it doesn't have quite the same level of strategic concern. There's a license exception that would be available for that. A license exception is a stated authorization in our regulations that enables you or an exporter to take an item, send it out of the country without obtaining specific written approval in advance, because the nature of the transaction doesn't raise that level of concern. Other things that might fall under this license exception category would be temporary exports, just sending something out to repair or replace an item that was damaged or no longer functioning, that went out originally under an authorization. There are a lot of types of license exceptions that are specifically available. Next slide. So the reason I spent a few moments talking about exports and authorization, again, for exports, it seems pretty clear, but now let's go back to deemed exports. So if you have an export of an item that, say, requires a license, and let's use the same example to Egypt. The technology is controlled at a certain level that there is an X in the box for a shipment to Egypt. And now you have an Egyptian national in the United States and you want to transfer that technology.
What can I say? Okay, I'll continue on. Again, if the sound jumps out, by all means interrupt and we'll try to figure out something else. So most of the changes that have existed, that have occurred, have been with regard to Russia. We've put in place a fairly staggering set of controls on Russia and Belarus in a very short period of time. And I just wanted to cover these very briefly. So we'll move to the next slide, the summary of BIS actions on Russia. The pace, the breadth, and the unanimity of the controls that we were able to place on Russia, truly amazing. The day the Russians invaded was the day that we put in place a comprehensive set of regulations. It's February 24th, the same day. We did it in association with 32 other countries who put in place substantially similar controls. And the controls were quite broad, capturing a wide variety of technologies. And this gives you a sense of, this slide gives you a sense of what we did. We expanded license requirements on virtually the full range of shipments to Russia and Belarus. For those, in essence, this means putting more X's in the box for virtually any item going there. Established a policy of denial for licensable transactions or licenses that existed. We suspended those, limited the use of license exceptions that I had spoken about. We expanded the range of things, of transfers that were subject to our regulations that were products made outside the country, but utilized U.S. origin technology. Put in place kind of an exemption, which for like-minded countries that put in place substantially similar controls, we minimized the burden of that, which I think contributed to overall broad, multilateral, like-minded approach on transfers to Russia and Belarus. We expanded controls on military users. We expanded controls on luxury goods, and more recently on items that would otherwise not be controlled, that would further the Russian development of their oil industry. And lately, as of earlier today, they expanded controls on other items that were in that EAR 99 category, items that we never really had a control on anywhere but embargoed countries like Cuba, heavy equipment to further degrade the Russians' ability to wage war. Let me close with just a few short slides on where you can find more information. The next slide, where to find the EAR on our website. Our website is www.dis.doc.gov. There's a drop-down menu under regulations where you can find our export administration regulations or a link to the government printing office's specific listing of the Code of Federal Regulations, those regulations that exist government-wide. Next slide. There's another view of our website with a circle on new to exporting. This links you to a series of introductory videos. Next slide on introduction to export controls. Shows you some animated videos. The next slide, something called the online training room. These are short animated videos that run about 8 minutes each that are designed to try to explain in clear, jargon-free manner specific aspects of the export administration regulations that may be applicable to a variety of small business interests or those in, say, academia. We have 10 export control videos. They've had over 100,000 views in the 2.5 years that we've had them up, and we found them to be very, very helpful. And with the last slide, contact information, will show you how you can reach us through phone, or there are email access as well. So, having covered a real broad range of information, suffered a technological glitch in the middle of it, to make sure I open it up to any questions that you may have on anything that I've covered.
Yeah, we do have some questions. We have, who is responsible for obtaining the license for joint research?
The responsible party is going to be the person that is the one that is making the export or the deemed export, the one who is conveying the technology to the overseas party. If we're talking about a deemed export, or if we're talking about a deemed export, it could be the person or the entity that is leading a group on a tour of a facility where technology will be conveyed, or a researcher that is conveying the information that's subject to specific control. It's not the originator, but the person who's actually affecting the export or deemed export.
Thank you. Is tangible material that is published subject to EAR? For example, if we want to export plasmids whose sequences are published, would that material be subject to EAR?
If the information is published, it typically falls outside of the export administration regulations.
All right. Let's see, one more here. What is the lab responsibilities versus company in a joint research projects like CRADA?
You're going to find there's probably some level of shared responsibility. Whoever is the party that's conveying an information to a foreign person is the one or the organization on whom the primary responsibility will fall. There will be a shared responsibility in the sense of what is this technology is this technology something that is subject to the regulations, and what level of authorization is required if it is? That may be some cooperative effort between the different parties to determine who has that expertise to be able to classify the item. But it's typically the responsibility falls on the person that is actually, or the organization that is conveying the information. They're the persons who are affecting an export or a deemed export.
All right, thank you. And then going through the applying for a license. So how long is the application turnaround process?
The applications typically range, I think our average processing time, I believe now, is 28 days. That encompasses those license applications that are truly problematic and have been pending for several months. But on the other side, we have those that go through relatively quickly in a matter of just a few days. It is an interagency process where we seek the advice of our interagency partners, the Departments of Defense, State, and Energy, on license applications, and other agencies as well, depending on the destination. So some are quicker, and some can take some time, but the average is 28 days.
All right. How and who decides whether research is fundamental?
The definition for fundamental research in these instances are typically whether the information is intended for broad release. If it is meant to be retained as a proprietary set of proprietary plans, then that, by virtue of its being withheld from broad circulation, takes it outside fundamental. Fundamental research is that which is intended to be broadly made available, and there's a specific definition on one of the pages that talks about fundamental research. Again, it's how will it be made available? Will it be made broadly available? The specific definition, fundamental research, means research in science, engineering, mathematics, the results of which ordinarily are published and shared broadly.
Great.
We can also help if people have specific questions. So much of this is fact specific.
Right.
If there are questions, you can direct them to our office, and we can provide more detailed guidance on the specific nature of the transaction or of the technology. This presentation treats with a fairly broad brush some fairly nuanced provisions, and there is within our website, there is a frequently asked questions page that provides a lot of detail on deemed exports, and it provides a lot of information on fundamental research.
Thank you for that. I know there's we actually still have several questions and about 9 minutes left.
Okay.
Let's take a couple more here. Let's see. How does export control work with patent prosecution and secrecy orders?
If I can't speak definitively to the patent process, I'm not that familiar with it, so I would refer the question to PTO on that. With regard to any kind of controls that have been placed on dissemination of the information, that would guide what authorization might be required. If, for example, technological information comes in and it's classified for work, and then there will be product that's manufactured or technology will be derived from this, it may be subject to our regulations, and it may not be. For example, if information is coming from a Department of Defense entity, and there is a requirement that there is a secret label on it, the end result of that research is very unlikely to be subject to our regulations, but subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls within the Department of State that regulates military items. The nature of the information coming in may tell you which organization has responsibility on the output side, but it's more likely to be a definitive guide as to whether or not some agency is putting some sort of restriction, imposing a requirement to obtain authorization. I'm not sure that distinction is clear, but I hope it is.
Okay, that's fair enough. Does EAR protected research require similar security practices as ITAR?
Okay. ITAR is the International Transfer of Arms Regulations. Those are the regulations that cover defense articles and services administered by the Department of Defense. They have their set of controls on the dissemination of technology. I can't speak to those because it's outside of my role here, but it's similar in concept. One might think that there would be more stringent controls on the export of key technology for advanced fighter aircraft as opposed to, say, a laptop. And you'd probably be right. But it's how they control it. I can't speak to that. I can only talk about how it's controlled under our regulations. But the concepts are similar. The output of the technology could require further authorization depending on the circumstances.
What if the receiver breached the authorization?
If a recipient transfers technology without authorization, there are both criminal and administrative penalties under the export administration regulations. And they can be quite significant. We have individuals that are in prison right now as a result of export control. The more likely instance you'd see for many of these would be administrative penalties, and these can be fairly significant. On the export control side, we were talking about physical products. We had one of our largest settlements with an organization called ZTE that many people are familiar with. The fine was $1.2 billion, several hundred million of which was suspended, but it was still a $500 million fine. Now that's not typically what you expect to see. That's extraordinary. But I would point out that there are both criminal and administrative penalties that do exist.
So for a CRADA, is it enough to state that all must be citizens or green card, or do we need to actually check IDs?
There's a responsibility to comply, and it depends on it's incumbent upon the party to do what it takes to comply. In many instances, there may not be a requirement to regulations to check, but there is a requirement not to violate. Much like there's a speed limit violation on our highways, but there's no obligation to check your speedometer.
Okay. Let's see, is there an EAR exemption for government employees?
There are license exceptions that enable a transfer to government parties overseas that satisfies an authorization or a requirement. There's not an exemption for government employees per se from these regulations. We have had penalties attached to U.S. government employees that have violated the export administration regulations. So while status as a government employee may make it easier to receive information, it doesn't exempt you from controls themselves.
All right. Have there been any updates BIS can share on identifying and controlling emerging and foundational technologies?
Yeah, that's a good one. The Export Control Reform Act of 2018 required that our agency identify emerging technologies. These are technologies that may be of importance in the national security sphere, where we, the U.S. government, may be able to put in place controls and ought to put in place controls in a multilateral environment to restrict a broad availability of an emerging technology that may be significant. This has been a very challenging effort. We put in place a Gaines notice of proposed rulemaking where we asked for input from the business community on 14 technology spheres from artificial intelligence and on into others to see if there was a specific area where we could impose controls without killing the industry. The design and the intent is to be very targeted. We put in place controls on 38 specific emerging technologies in 5 rules over the last 3.5 years. It's an ongoing process to identify these technologies, and again, to do so in a manner that would be efficacious, that it would serve the purpose but not kill the industry. But it's been a big challenge for us.
All right, you have about 30 seconds to answer the last question. If the software is determined as EAR 99 and recipient is Egypt, is this subject to export control?
It is subject to our regulations, but it would be but it would not require a license unless somehow the Egyptian party were or somehow sanctioned.
All right. Well, thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody, so much. We appreciate it. We apologize for the delay right there in the middle. There will be a survey coming out, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much, Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you all for your time and attention to this. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.